They say betrayal starts with a whisper, and I heard mine in Gloria's voice that night. We just finished dinner, roast chicken, her favorite, and she poured herself a second glass of wine. The way she kept glancing at the table, as though avoiding my gaze, made me uneasy. Then, with a deep breath, she started. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, her tone measured, almost rehearsed. My stomach sank before she even continued. There was something about the way her fingers fidgeted with her wine glass, the way her lips curved into a faint, nervous smile. "I think I need some space. To figure things out. To find myself again." The words didn't register at first. I stared at her, blinking slowly, as if that would somehow clear the fog gathering in my mind. Find herself? This wasn't a phrase I expected from Gloria, the sharp, confident woman who'd always seemed so certain of what she wanted. "Are you saying you need to leave?" I asked, carefully keeping my voice even. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. No, nothing like that. I need to explore a little. Meet new people. Experience things. It's not about us, Ethan. It's about me." The way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me, told me everything I needed to know. I should have exploded, demanded answers, but instead, I forced a small smile. "If that's what you need," I said quietly, folding my hands together on the table. Her surprise was almost comical. She had braced herself for a fight, maybe even tears, but I gave her neither. That's the thing about Gloria. She always thought she was the smarter one, the one in control, but she didn't know me as well as she thought she did. As she left the table, I sat there, staring at the empty plates, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was colder than that. A creeping resolve was taking hold. A decision that whatever Gloria thought she was playing at, I wouldn't let her win. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, already planning my first move. The next morning, Gloria was all smiles like nothing had happened. She hummed while making coffee, her usual routine unbroken. But I noticed the small cracks in her facade. Her movements were a little too brisk, her smile a little too bright. She wasn't as calm as she pretended to be. That realization gave me a grim satisfaction. If she thought she could drop a bombshell like that and carry on as if our marriage hadn't been derailed, she had underestimated me. "You seem cheerful today," I said, sipping my coffee and watching her from across the kitchen. "Just trying to stay positive," she replied, not meeting my gaze. She kept her attention on the toaster, as if her life depended on the perfect golden brown slice of bread. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she practically lunged for it. That was new. Gloria was never jumpy about her phone. As she picked it up, I caught the faintest flush of pink rising in her cheeks before she turned away, shielding the screen. I filed the reaction away in my mind. That little moment told me more than any words ever could. The rest of the day was uneventful, but the wheels in my head kept turning. Gloria wasn't just finding herself. She was testing the waters, seeing how far she could push before I broke. And if there was someone else, I'd find out. That evening, I started setting up my pieces. While she went out for a late-night walk, something else she'd recently picked up, I took the opportunity to access her phone. She'd left it charging on the kitchen counter, and luck was on my side. She hadn't changed her passcode. Her messages told a story I wasn't sure I was ready for. There were casual exchanges with a man named Julian, someone she claimed to know from work. At first glance, the text seemed harmless, talk of office deadlines and meeting schedules. But the tone was off. There were emojis, a playful edge to their words. And then there was the one that stopped me cold. "I can't wait to see you tonight." Same place? I felt the heat rise to my face, but I forced myself to stay calm. Confronting her now would only tip her off. I copied the thread, taking photos with my own phone, before carefully placing hers back where she'd left it. When she returned, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. She showered, humming softly, and slipped under the covers without a word. Her new habits didn't surprise me anymore. What did surprise me was how easy it was for her to lie. Not with words, but with her silence. By the time my alarm buzzed the next morning, I had decided on my next step. If Gloria wanted to keep secrets, she'd find out how it felt when I started keeping some of my own. I spent the next few days playing the part of the oblivious husband. Gloria didn't know it, but every time she picked up her phone, went for a walk, or mentioned a work meeting, I was documenting it all. She was too confident, too sure I'd stay blind to the cracks in her story. I started with her movements. She always said she was going to the gym or running errands, but her timing didn't add up. So one evening, I followed her. It was easier than I expected. Gloria's route was predictable. She drove straight to a high-end cafe across town, a place we'd never been together. I parked far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to see her enter. A few minutes later, a man joined her at the table by the window. Julian. He was as polished as his text made him seem. Tailored blazer, easy smile, the kind of guy who looked like he practiced charm in the mirror. Gloria leaned toward him as they talked, her expression animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. It stung more than I wanted to admit. Seeing her like that, laughing, glowing, made me realize how distant she'd become from me. But the anger that followed burned hotter than the pain. After about an hour, they left together. Julian opened the door to his car with a gallant flourish, and Gloria slid inside like she belonged there. I stayed parked, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. This wasn't just some harmless exploration like she claimed. Gloria wasn't testing the waters. She'd already dived in. The next step was gaining access to her digital life. I needed more than glimpses through her phone. I needed everything. So, while she showered one night, I installed tracking software on her devices. It wasn't difficult. Years of handling tech projects at work had made me proficient. Within hours, I had access to her messages, location, and emails. And that's when the real story started to unfold. It turned out that Julian wasn't just a random fling. He was a predator, a master manipulator with a history of entangling women in messy affairs. His charm masked something far darker. I found emails from other women, angry, pleading, warning him to stay away. There were legal threats, accusations of harassment, even a few references to financial scandals. Gloria, of course, was oblivious to all of this. To her, he was a thrilling escape from our ordinary life. But I saw him for what he was, a wrecking ball, and she was just his next target. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to plan this carefully. Gloria had made her move. Now it was my turn. That night, as she curled up beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. She had no idea how far I was willing to go to protect myself from her betrayal. If she wanted to play games, I'd make sure she didn't like the ending. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Gloria's lies grew bolder, her confidence in her deceit almost laughable. She didn't even try to hide her late nights anymore. Working late, she'd say casually, not even glancing up as she slipped on heels far too elegant for the office. Her wardrobe had changed, too. Sleek dresses, bold lipstick, perfume that lingered long after she'd gone. I played my part perfectly. Each time she offered an excuse, I nodded, even smiled, as if I believed every word. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The more comfortable she felt, the more careless she became. I wasn't just collecting evidence now. I was preparing for the kill shot. One evening, she mentioned a team-building dinner. I knew better. My tracking app showed her heading straight to Julian's condo. I spent the night reviewing the data I'd gathered. GPS logs, copies of messages, and screenshots of her correspondence with Julian. There was one particular thread that sent a chill through me. Julian, we'll have the place to ourselves this weekend. Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything? Gloria, not a clue. Ethan's too wrapped up in work to notice anything. Besides, he trusts me. The audacity of it was almost amusing. She thought I trusted her. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or let my fury consume me. But then came the final piece of the puzzle. A message from Julian popped up in her inbox, titled simply, Details for Saturday. Inside were instructions for a weekend getaway at a private resort 2 hours away. He'd booked the most luxurious suite, complete with a spa and ocean view. This was it, her betrayal, wrapped in an itinerary. I could have stormed into the room, thrown the screenshots in her face, and demanded answers. But what would that achieve? She'd cry, deny, twist the narrative to make herself the victim. No, confronting her now would be playing into her hands. Instead, I set my plan into motion. That night, after Gloria fell asleep, I made a few calls. One to a lawyer I trusted, another to a private investigator who specialized in discreet operations. I shared everything I had collected and laid out what I wanted. Proof so damning that Gloria and Julian wouldn't have a leg to stand on. By morning, I was calm again. Gloria, on the other hand, was practically glowing as she packed her bag for her work retreat. Don't wait up, she teased, pecking me on the cheek before heading out the door. I watched her leave, my expression blank. She didn't notice the car parked discreetly down the street, the investigator ready to tail her every move. This wasn't just a retreat for her. It was the beginning of the end. Gloria's work retreat was a lie so flimsy it almost insulted me. As she drove off, I tracked her every turn on my phone. She wasn't heading toward the company's regional office like she claimed. Instead, her route led directly to Julian's condo. The investigator I'd hired was thorough. Within hours, I received photos of Gloria stepping out of her car, overnight bag in hand, greeted by Julian at the door. He looked smug, leaning in to kiss her cheek. She laughed, tilting her head in that way she used to when we first fell in love. The sting of it was sharp but brief. I'd steel myself for this moment. I couldn't afford emotions now. They were distractions, and I needed to stay sharp. What followed was almost too predictable. The two of them spent the afternoon at his place before driving out to the resort Julian had so meticulously planned. The investigator trailed them, capturing images of their intimate exchanges in public, holding hands at a rest stop, laughing as they checked into the hotel. Back home, I kept myself busy, laying the groundwork for my next move. It was surprisingly peaceful, almost therapeutic to focus on the details. The investigator kept me updated, sending photos of their activities. A romantic dinner by candlelight, drinks by the pool, and a walk along the shoreline under the moonlight. Julian was pulling out all the stops, probably convinced he was winning Gloria over completely. But the investigators' work uncovered more than just their affair. Julian's polished exterior hid a mess of secrets. The man was neck-deep in lawsuits, fraudulent investments, and shady business dealings. He had a long history of seducing women in positions of power to gain access to their networks and resources. Gloria, it seemed, wasn't just a fling for him. She was another tool, a stepping stone to something bigger. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. When Gloria returned home 2 days later, she walked through the door with the confidence of someone who believed she'd gotten away with everything. She smiled brightly, dropping her bag on the floor. "Miss me?" she asked, her tone playful. I gave her a casual nod, keeping my voice steady. "Of course. How was the retreat?" "Exhausting," she sighed, flopping onto the couch. "So many meetings, but it was productive. I think it'll really help my team." Her lie rolled off her tongue, so easily it made me sick. She was playing me for a fool, and she didn't even realize the game had already shifted. As she chatted about her work weekend, I nodded, feigning interest. All the while, I pictured the dossier I'd compiled. Photos, messages, and details of Julian's sordid history. It wasn't just a collection of evidence. It was a weapon, and soon, I'd be ready to use it. But not yet. Timing was everything, and Gloria wasn't the only one I planned to expose. Gloria had no idea her perfect weekend was unraveling as soon as it ended. I had everything I needed to dismantle her little fantasy, but I wasn't content with just exposing her. This was bigger than us now. It was about showing her and Julian the consequences of their deceit. While Gloria returned to her normal routine, cooking, errands, and her suddenly less convincing stories about work, I spent my evenings strategizing. I reached out to a former colleague, Derek, who had connections in corporate auditing. "Julian Hayes?" Derek said when I mentioned the name. "I've heard of him. He's got a reputation for skating just inside the law, or at least appearing to." "Not anymore," I replied. "I'm sending you some files. Let's see how clean he looks after a little digging." Derek promised to have his team start immediately. I knew Julian had enemies, people who'd been waiting for him to slip. All they needed was a nudge in the right direction, and I was happy to provide it. The first crack came faster than I expected. Derek called 3 days later, his voice tinged with excitement. "You're onto something big, Ethan. Julian's been funneling money through shell companies, and one of them's tied to a charity. If this goes public—" "Make sure it does," I said, "and make it loud." By the time the weekend arrived, the first ripple hit. A local business blog published an exposé detailing Julian's shady financial dealings. It was a small article, but it was enough to start the chain reaction. Gloria, oblivious, spent Saturday morning tidying the house, humming as if she hadn't spent the week lying through her teeth. "Thinking about heading to the mall later," she said over breakfast. "Need to pick up a few things for work." "Go for it," I replied, barely looking up from my coffee. "Take your time." She left an hour later, dressed sharper than usual for a trip to the mall. I checked the tracker. Her first stop wasn't the shopping center. It was Julian's condo. By the afternoon, the exposé had gained traction. Comments flooded the blog, and larger news outlets began picking up the story. Julian's name trended briefly on social media, his reputation already starting to crumble. That evening, Gloria returned home in a foul mood, her usual cheerful facade cracking. She barely greeted me before retreating to the bedroom, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I knew she was messaging Julian, trying to figure out why his world was suddenly on fire. I wanted to laugh, but I held back. The timing wasn't right. Not yet. Instead, I sent a message to Derek. "Turn up the heat." By Sunday morning, Julian's troubles had gone from whispers to full-blown headlines. Multiple outlets were now running stories about his fraudulent business practices and ties to questionable investors. The articles were scathing, complete with charts detailing his money laundering schemes and interviews with former associates who were all too eager to speak out. Gloria was quieter than usual over breakfast, scrolling through her phone with a furrowed brow. She barely touched her coffee, her usual chatter replaced by stilted, distracted responses. "Something wrong?" I asked casually, masking my satisfaction. "Huh? Oh no. Just tired," she mumbled, forcing a weak smile. "Lots on my mind, I bet." Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it quickly before silencing it and tucking it into her pocket. I didn't need to see the screen to know it was Julian. He'd been trying to control the damage all night, likely calling in favors and threatening lawsuits. It wouldn't matter. I made sure of that. That afternoon, I took a drive to clear my head, or at least it's what I told Gloria. In truth, I met with the private investigator to go over the latest intel. "She's definitely feeling the pressure," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were fresh photos of Gloria and Julian meeting in his condo. The images showed them in deep conversation, Gloria gesturing animatedly, while Julian looked unusually tense. "Good," I said, closing the folder. "Let's keep it that way." Before leaving, the investigator handed me a USB drive. "Here's the footage you wanted. Everything from the resort, clean and time-stamped." I pocketed it without looking. That little piece of evidence would be the nail in the coffin when the time came. When I returned home, Gloria was already in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She greeted me with a strained smile, the tension in her shoulders unmistakable. "How was your drive?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Relaxing," I said, leaning against the counter. "Sometimes it's nice to just get some fresh air, you know?" She nodded, but didn't say much else. Her focus seemed elsewhere, her mind spinning with whatever crisis Julian had dragged her into. Later that night, as she slept, I reviewed the footage from the USB drive. It was all there, her and Julian at the resort, holding hands, kissing, laughing like carefree lovers. The final clip showed them returning to their suite, arms around each other. My stomach twisted as I watched, but I didn't let the emotion take over. I had no time for that. This was ammunition, nothing more. As I shut off the screen, I couldn't help but smile. The web around Gloria and Julian was tightening, and soon, there would be no escape. By Monday, Gloria's veneer of calm had nearly worn through. She spent most of the morning glued to her phone, pacing the living room while pretending to be catching up on work. She thought I wasn't paying attention, but every tense glance at her screen told me otherwise. "Busy day?" I asked, leaning casually against the doorway. "Yeah, just a lot going on," she replied, her tone clipped. "Anything I can help with?" She froze for half a second before shaking her head. "No, it's fine. Just the usual." The lies were becoming so obvious, they bordered on insulting. But I didn't press her. I wanted her to feel like she still had control, even as everything was slipping through her fingers. That afternoon, Gloria left the house in a rush, claiming she had a last-minute meeting with a client. I watched from the window as she sped off, checking the tracking app on my phone to confirm what I already knew. She was headed to Julian's condo again. The investigator, ever vigilant, followed her and sent me updates. This time, they didn't linger inside. They left together, driving to a law firm downtown. My curiosity piqued. Were they scrambling to mount a defense? Julian's legal troubles were growing by the hour, and Gloria's involvement, however indirect, was bound to come under scrutiny. When she returned home later that evening, her mood was sour. She tossed her bag onto the couch and poured herself a glass of wine without a word. "Tough day?" I asked, deliberately keeping my tone light. "Something like that," she muttered, avoiding eye contact. I let the silence linger, watching her closely. She was unraveling, and I could see the guilt and fear flickering behind her eyes. It was only a matter of time before she cracked. That night, I reviewed the latest updates from the investigator. The law firm Julian and Gloria had visited was known for its aggressive reputation, specializing in damage control for high-profile clients. It confirmed what I suspected. Julian was in full-blown panic mode, and Gloria was now tethered to his sinking ship. I stared at the folder of evidence on my desk, the weight of it sinking in. Everything was in place. Gloria thought she was playing me, but I'd turned the tables long ago. Tomorrow, I begin the final phase of my plan. Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the storm I was about to unleash. Gloria seemed distracted, scrolling through her phone at the breakfast table while sipping her coffee. "I might need to work late tonight," she said absently. "There's a lot piling up at the office." Do whatever you need to, I replied casually, hiding my satisfaction behind a sip of coffee. She didn't know that her so-called late work was already under a microscope. Julian's troubles had reached their boiling point. Overnight, another article had dropped, this one digging into his personal life. It hinted at affairs, naming Gloria as one of the key figures in his circle. Her name wasn't spelled out directly, but it wouldn't take much for people to connect the dots. I forwarded the article to the private investigator with a single note. Make sure this reaches the right people. That afternoon, I received a call from Derek. You've outdone yourself, he said, chuckling. This is going viral. Julian's investors are pulling out, and there's talk of legal action. If I had to guess, he'll be lucky if he's not indicted by the end of the week. Good, I replied. Keep the pressure on. I'm just getting started. With Julian on the ropes, I turned my attention to Gloria. It wasn't enough to bring down Julian. I needed her to face the consequences of her betrayal. When she came home that evening, Gloria was visibly rattled. She barely mumbled a greeting before retreating to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. I waited until I heard the faint murmur of her voice, knowing she was on the phone with Julian. It didn't take long for the tracker app to confirm she'd called him. The conversation, though muted through the app, was heated. I couldn't hear every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Panic. When she emerged an hour later, she tried to act normal. I'm going to take a shower, she said, avoiding eye contact. Sure, I replied, feigning indifference. As soon as the water started running, I opened my laptop and prepared the next phase. The investigator had provided a list of Gloria's professional contacts, people she worked with, respected, even admired. They were about to learn exactly what kind of person she really was. I drafted an email, attaching select photos and screenshots of her messages with Julian. Nothing explicit, just enough to shatter the facade she'd so carefully constructed. Then, with a deep breath, I hit send. The first responses came within minutes. Shocked, angry, confused. Her colleagues were blindsided, and the ripple effects were immediate. Gloria stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, oblivious to the firestorm brewing in her inbox. Feel better? I asked, watching her closely. Yeah, she said, smiling weakly. Thanks. I didn't reply, just nodded. The seeds of her downfall had been planted, and soon she'd reap the harvest. The next morning, Gloria was unusually quiet. She picked at her breakfast, glancing at her phone every few seconds, her expression growing darker with each notification. I didn't need to ask what was wrong. I already knew. The emails had reached their targets. Her colleagues weren't just reading the evidence, they were spreading it. Whispers would turn into shouts, and before long, she'd be standing in the middle of a hurricane she couldn't control. Is everything okay? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Just work stuff, she muttered, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she didn't silence it. Instead, she got up abruptly, muttering something about needing fresh air. She grabbed her coat and left, leaving me alone in the kitchen with a smile I struggled to suppress. The investigator had already updated me on Julian's morning. It wasn't going well. Calls from investors had started at dawn, demanding explanations. The media frenzy had drawn the attention of law enforcement, and rumors swirled that a formal investigation was imminent. Gloria's name had come up in passing during these discussions. For now, she was just a small piece of the puzzle, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Julian's desperation to save himself would make her expendable, and I knew he wouldn't hesitate to throw her under the bus if it suited him. By the afternoon, Gloria returned home looking pale and disoriented. She barely acknowledged me as she walked through the door, heading straight to the bedroom. I gave her some space, knowing she was processing the unraveling of her carefully curated world. When she finally emerged, her face was a mask of tension. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "What about?" I've been dealing with something at work. It's complicated," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Some personal stuff has gotten mixed up with professional things, and it's causing problems." Her lies were so thin, they were almost laughable. "Is this about Julian?" I asked casually, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened, just for a moment, before she forced a confused look onto her face. "What? No. Why would you think that?" I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. You've mentioned him before. I just thought maybe it had something to do with the articles about him all over the news. Her face flushed, and she looked away. I didn't know about those, she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Really? They're hard to miss, I replied, keeping my tone light. I'm sure the office must be buzzing about it. She didn't answer, just mumbled something about needing to make a call before disappearing into the bedroom again. I didn't follow her. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder containing the final pieces of evidence. Everything was coming to a head, and Gloria's crumbling composure was proof she knew it too. The next strike would be the hardest yet, and this time, it wouldn't just be Julian feeling the blow. That evening, Gloria sat on the edge of the couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was pale, her usual air of confidence replaced by a fragile tension. The cracks in her demeanor were growing wider, and I could feel the weight of her unraveling. Something wrong? I asked, feigning concern. No, she said quickly, too quickly. Just tired. She was a terrible liar. Gloria's world was crumbling around her, but she hadn't yet pieced together that I was the one pulling the strings. Julian's name was now synonymous with scandal, his reputation a smoking ruin. And Gloria? She was starting to feel the fallout. While she sulked, I prepared my next move. The investigator had delivered fresh footage, this time of Gloria and Julian at the law firm. Their desperate attempts to plot damage control had been recorded in perfect clarity. The beauty of this moment wasn't just in their betrayal, but in their foolishness. They thought they could scheme their way out of the mess Julian's life had become, but every step they took only brought them closer to the edge of the cliff. The next morning, I released a curated selection of evidence to Gloria's professional circle. Emails, meeting notes, and text exchanges that painted her as complicit in Julian's questionable dealings. I knew the fallout would be swift and brutal. It didn't take long for the calls to start. Gloria's phone buzzed incessantly, and her attempts to keep her panic under control were failing. I have to go into the office, she said abruptly, grabbing her bag. What's going on? I asked, pretending to be surprised. Nothing. Just work stuff, she muttered, avoiding my gaze. As she left, I checked the tracker app. She wasn't going to her office. She was heading straight to Julian's condo. By the afternoon, the dam broke. A colleague of Gloria's, someone she clearly hadn't confided in, forwarded me a message that had been circulating among her team. It was a screenshot of one of the emails I'd sent, accompanied by a scathing commentary about how disappointing her behavior had been. The tone of the message was clear. Gloria's professional reputation was in tatters, and the vultures were circling. When she returned home that evening, she looked defeated. Her usual sharp attire was wrinkled, her makeup smudged as if she'd been crying. Long day? I asked as she slumped into a chair. She didn't respond at first, just stared blankly at the floor. Yeah, something like that. For the first time, I felt a twinge of pity. She had no idea the storm wasn't over yet. Later that night, while Gloria showered, I reviewed the investigator's latest report. Julian was spiraling. His investors had frozen his accounts, and whispers of criminal charges were growing louder. He had gone from untouchable to untethered, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he turned on Gloria to save himself. Good. Let him. The endgame was approaching, and soon, neither of them would have anything left. By the end of the week, Gloria was barely holding it together. Her phone never stopped buzzing, the notifications coming in rapid fire. Her colleagues were demanding explanations, and Julian was likely flooding her with pleas for help. Over breakfast, she sat silently, her untouched coffee growing cold as she stared at her phone. I could feel the tension radiating off her, but I didn't press her. Instead, I let her stew in the mess she'd created. I'll be out most of the day, she finally said, breaking the silence. Anything important? I asked casually. Just meetings. Her vague reply was confirmation enough. She didn't trust herself to explain. The tracker showed her heading back to Julian's condo, but this time, she didn't stay long. The investigator called me shortly after. They're falling apart, he said with a chuckle. Julian's condo is crawling with lawyers. It's a circus over there. What about Gloria? I asked. She left in a hurry. Looked like they had a fight. I got some audio through the bug we planted in Julian's living room. Do you want the highlights? Absolutely. He sent me a file, and I listened to it while sitting at my desk. Gloria's voice was sharp, filled with frustration. You said this wouldn't blow back on me, Julian, she snapped. And I didn't expect you to get dragged into it. He fired back. This is your mess now, too. Figure it out. The venom in his tone was palpable. Julian wasn't just panicking. He was angry, and Gloria had become his scapegoat. I almost laughed out loud. The cracks in their little partnership had turned into full-blown fissures. It was only a matter of time before one of them made a desperate move, and I was more than ready for it. When Gloria returned home that evening, she looked exhausted. She dropped her bag by the door and went straight to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine before slumping into a chair. "Rough day?" I asked, masking my satisfaction. "Yeah," she said flatly. "Anything you want to talk about?" "No," she snapped, then sighed, her tone softening. "Sorry, it's just been a lot." I nodded, pretending to sympathize. She had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Later that night, I received a text from Derek. "Julian's lawyers are circling the drain. He's desperate. Expect fireworks soon." I stared at the message, a grin spreading across my face. The tipping point had arrived, and I was ready to watch it all burn. The next morning, Gloria woke up earlier than usual. She moved through the house in a rush, skipping breakfast entirely. Her phone was practically glued to her hand, and she avoided eye contact as she grabbed her keys. "Early meeting?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "Yeah, busy day," she mumbled, already halfway out the door. I watched her leave, the tracker app confirming her destination, Julian's condo. Again, but this time, things were different. Derek called me an hour later, his voice tinged with anticipation. "Julian's sinking fast," he said. "I just got word that one of his former partners has flipped. He's cooperating with the authorities. It's over for him." "What about Gloria?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "She's tied up in this deeper than you think. The emails we leaked made sure of that. When Julian goes down, he's taking her with him. And Ethan, it's happening soon." I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. Gloria had no idea she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I was about to give her the final push. By mid-afternoon, Gloria came home looking frazzled. Her usual poise was gone, replaced by a frantic energy that she couldn't hide. "I need to pack a bag," she said abruptly, heading toward the bedroom. "Why?" I asked, following her. "Work trip," she said quickly, tossing clothes into a suitcase. "Last minute. Nothing big." Her lie was almost pathetic in its transparency. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a calm I didn't feel. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Of course," she snapped, not meeting my gaze. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she grabbed it like it was a lifeline. She read the screen, her face tightening, and then shoved it into her pocket. "You're sure?" I pressed. "Yes," she snapped again, zipping her suitcase with a sharp tug. "I just need to go." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the empty house. I didn't have to wait long for the next update. The investigator called me that evening with a simple message. "Julian's condo just got raided." I let out a low whistle, a mix of satisfaction and anticipation building in my chest. "What about Gloria?" I asked. "She left before it happened, but she's panicking. She went straight to a hotel, probably trying to figure out her next move." I sat back in my chair, a smile tugging at my lips. Gloria was cornered, and the walls were closing in. Julian was finished, and she was next. The dominoes were falling, just as I'd planned. By the next morning, Gloria's frantic state had reached its peak. She called me around 8 a.m., her voice shaky and rushed. "Ethan, I'll be staying out of town for a couple of days," she said, not waiting for my reply. "It's just work stuff. Don't worry, okay?" The lie was as hollow as her tone. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me with the image of her pacing in a hotel room, clinging to what little control she thought she had left. The news about Julian had spread like wildfire overnight. The raid on his condo was plastered across every media outlet, and headlines detailed his fraudulent empire, the cascade of legal charges, and the growing list of former allies turning against him. Gloria's involvement wasn't explicitly named yet, but the dots were being connected. I knew her phone would be buzzing with panicked messages from her colleagues, desperate for explanations. She wouldn't have any answers, just more lies to dig herself deeper. Derek called me mid-morning, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Ethan, it's happening. Julian's been arrested." "Arrested?" I repeated, a grin spreading across my face. "Yep. They picked him up at his lawyer's office. It's all over the news. And get this, he's already naming names to save himself. If Gloria thought she was safe, she's about to learn otherwise." "Perfect," I said, leaning back in my chair. Julian's desperation was my final weapon. If Gloria thought their partnership would protect her, she was about to realize she'd made a critical mistake. By evening, Gloria returned home, visibly shaken. She looked exhausted, her makeup smudged, her clothes wrinkled. She dropped her suitcase by the door and collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Rough trip?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She didn't answer. For a long moment, she just sat there, her breathing uneven. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years: fear. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I need to tell you something." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. "I'm listening." She hesitated, her lips trembling as she searched for the right words. But before she could speak, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She flinched, snatching it up and reading the screen. Her face went pale. "Who's that?" I asked, feigning curiosity. "Nobody," she said quickly, locking the screen and standing up. I need a minute." She rushed toward the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room. My phone buzzed a moment later, a message from the investigator. "Julian's statement implicates Gloria. It's public now. She's done." I stared at the message, my chest tightening with satisfaction. The trap had sprung, and Gloria had no way out. Gloria spent the next few hours locked in the bedroom, no doubt watching the news unfold and scrambling for a way to salvage the mess. I gave her space, letting the weight of her actions settle on her shoulders. She had dug this grave, now she would have to lie in it. When she finally emerged, her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She stood in the doorway, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Ethan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." I looked up from the laptop, feigning surprise. "What's going on?" She hesitated, her bottom lip trembling as if the words physically pained her. "There's something I need to explain. About Julian." I closed the laptop with deliberate slowness, leaning back in my chair. "Julian? The guy all over the news for fraud and embezzlement? What about him?" Her breath hitched, and I saw the cracks widening. "I didn't know. I didn't think it would get this bad." "Didn't know what?" I asked, my tone cool and measured. "That you were having an affair with a con artist? Or that he'd drag you down with him when the truth came out?" Her eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, she seemed truly at a loss. You knew?" I stood, crossing the room slowly. "Of course I knew, Gloria. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the late nights, the lies, the way you lit up every time he messaged you? I've known for weeks." She took a step back, tears streaming down her face now. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It got out of control." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Out of control? No, Gloria. This wasn't an accident. You made choices, calculated, selfish choices, and now you're reaping the consequences." She collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands. "Please, Ethan, I can fix this. I'll cut all ties with Julian, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. I picked up a folder from the table and dropped it onto the couch beside her. "Consider this your wake-up call." She opened it with trembling hands, her face blanching as she saw the evidence inside. Photos, emails, text messages, all meticulously cataloged. Everything I'd collected over weeks of planning. "This isn't just about me," I continued. "Your colleagues know. The authorities know. Julian's already thrown you under the bus to save himself. You're finished, Gloria." Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't waver. This wasn't the time for pity. The next few days were chaos. Gloria's name was officially tied to Julian's case, and her professional world crumbled overnight. Calls from work stopped coming. Friends distanced themselves. She became a pariah, her reputation irrevocably tarnished. I filed for divorce the following week, citing adultery and presenting my evidence. The legal proceedings were swift. There was no room for argument on her part. Gloria moved out shortly after, her belongings packed into a few boxes. She looked broken, but I didn't let it affect me. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Months later, as I sat on the deck of my newly purchased home, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind lessons I wouldn't forget. Gloria's betrayal had been a turning point, a reminder that trust and love weren't things to be taken for granted. As for Julian, his empire was gone, his name synonymous with disgrace. Gloria, last I heard, was still struggling to rebuild her life. It wasn't my concern anymore. I'd won the game, not by playing her tricks, but by being smarter, more patient. And in the end, I was free.